The Chamber of the Grand Conclave was the largest structure ever built by any civilization in the known galaxy. And on this day it was full to the last seat, with ambassadors, diplomats, and rulers from 42 spacefaring species who had gathered to decide the fate of a world they barely understood. Elder Vorshan sat in the far corner of the upper gallery, where the ancient delegates were placed, those whose species had faded from power long ago, but were still allowed a voice out of tradition and nothing more. He was old beyond what most species could imagine, over 12,000 years of memories folded into a body that looked like cracked stone wrapped in silver cloth, and his 4 eyes, once bright gold, had turned pale and milky with the weight of ages. Below him, the conclave floor buzzed with noise and movement as the representatives prepared to vote on what they called the Terran Containment Act. The proposal was simple in its cruelty. The human solar system, strip them of their 3 colony worlds, and force every human being in the galaxy back to their single blue planet where they could be watched and controlled forever. Ambassador Zale, of the Veil Dominion, stood at the central podium, his insectoid body clicking and shifting with excitement as he made the case for containment. "The humans breed too fast," he declared, his mandibles snapping with each word. "They spread too far, and they bring chaos wherever they go. Their music and their stories infect the young of other species. Their traders undercut our markets. Their soldiers fight with a recklessness that destabilizes every border they touch. They are a weed, and weeds must be pulled before they choke the garden." The Rithani collective speaker, a tall, pale figure with no mouth, who communicated through waves of psychic pressure, broadcast agreement across the chamber, and dozens of delegates nodded or clicked or hummed their approval. The humans had sent their own ambassador, a woman named Lena Vasek, and she stood at the smaller podium reserved for species under review. She was calm, and that calmness seemed to irritate the chamber more than anger would have. "We have done nothing to deserve this," she said, and her voice carried the quiet weight of someone who already knew she would not be heard. "We have followed every law. We have respected every border. We have traded fairly and fought only when attacked. What you are proposing is not containment. It is punishment for the crime of existing." Zale laughed, and it was an ugly sound, like glass breaking. "You exist too loudly," he said, and the chamber laughed with him. The vote was called, and it moved fast. 38 in favor, 4 against. The 4 being the Droon, the Felhari, the Morath, and the tiny Kess delegation, who had always traded kindly with Earth. It was done in minutes, and the fate of 9 billion humans was sealed with the casual speed of something that did not matter to anyone in the room. And then Vorshan stood. The gallery fell into an uncomfortable silence, not out of respect, but out of the kind of awkward stillness that follows when someone very old does something unexpected in a public place. His voice was thin, and it crackled like old paper tearing, but the chamber's sound systems carried every word to every ear and every mind in the room. "I must speak," he said. Zale waved a claw dismissively. "The vote is finished, Elder. Your words change nothing." "My words are not meant to change your vote," Vorshan replied. "They are meant to save your lives." That got their attention, not because they believed him, but because the statement was strange enough to be entertaining, and the conclave always did love a show. Vorshan descended slowly from the gallery, each step a careful negotiation between his ancient body and the force of gravity that seemed determined to pull him down for good. When he reached the central floor, he did not go to the podium. He simply stood in the middle of the open space and turned in a slow circle, looking at each delegation with those pale, knowing eyes. 12,000 years ago, he began, my people ruled an empire that stretched across 400 star systems. The Thyraxi were mighty and proud, and we feared nothing in the universe, because we had conquered everything we had ever found. He paused, and the silence in the chamber shifted from amusement to something that was almost attention. And then we found a species on a small world at the edge of our territory. They were young. They were primitive. They had barely learned to leave their own atmosphere. And we looked at them, and we saw what you see when you look at the humans. We saw something that grew too fast and spread too far, and we decided to contain them. Legs impatiently. Elder, this is a history lesson, and we do not have time for... We burned their colonies, Vorshan continued, as if Jael had not spoken, and his voice grew harder now, not louder, but denser, like metal cooling into its final shape. We killed their children. We drove them back to their homeworld, and we sealed them in, and we celebrated our wisdom. And then, we forgot about them. The Rythani speaker tilted its head, and a faint pulse of curiosity rippled through the chamber. How long did you forget? Asked the Droon ambassador, a massive creature like a living mountain of moss and stone. 2 generations of their species, Vorshan said, perhaps 60 of their years. And in those 60 years, they did something that we never imagined possible. They did not break. They did not accept. They did not fade. They built in silence and in darkness, behind the walls we had made for them. They built weapons we could not understand, and ships we could not see, and a fury we could not survive. His voice cracked, and for a moment he was not a diplomat or a relic. He was a survivor. And the terror of 12,000 years flickered behind his pale eyes, like a fire that had never gone out. They came for us on a single day. Every system, every fleet, every world, all at once, and when it was over, the Thraxi Empire was ash. 400 systems reduced to silence, billions of my people gone, not because the enemy was cruel, but because we had taught them what cruelty looked like, and they had learned the lesson better than we ever could have imagined. The chamber was truly quiet now. I am the last, Vorshan said, and he let that sentence hang in the air like smoke. 12,000 years, and I am still the last. There are no other Thraxi, there will never be another. We are a memory carried in one old body, and when I die, even that memory will be gone. He looked directly at Zael, and the Veil ambassador, for the first time in the session, did not speak. You look at the humans and you see a weed, Vorshan said. I look at the humans and I see the fire, the same eyes, the same refusal to die quietly. And I am telling you with everything I have left, do not do this. Do not corner them. Do not hurt their children. Do not give them a reason to remember what you did, because they will remember. They will remember every name and every face and every scream, and they will come for you. And when they do, you will wish you had listened to one old fool in a chamber full of clever beings who knew everything except the one thing that mattered. He stopped, and the silence lasted for 5 long breaths. Then Zael began to laugh. A wonderful story, Elder, the Veil ambassador said, clicking his mandibles in a show of exaggerated amusement. Truly dramatic, but we are not your ancient Thraxi. The Veil Dominion commands the largest fleet in the galaxy. The humans have 3 colony ships and a temper. I think we will manage. Laughter spread through the chamber like a disease, and within moments, the weight of Vorshan's words was buried under the sound of 42 species who were absolutely certain that they knew better than history. Vorshan said nothing more. He simply turned and walked out of the chamber, his slow footsteps lost beneath the noise. Ambassador Vasek watched him go, and something passed across her face. Not anger, not sadness, but a kind of quiet recognition, as if she had just seen a mirror and understood what the reflection meant. That night Vorshan sat alone in his quarters aboard the station. The lights dimmed to almost nothing, and he held in his hands a data crystal that contained the last historical records of the Thraxi Empire. Star maps of worlds that no longer existed, names of people that no one else remembered, and buried deep in the files, a single image of the species that had destroyed everything he had ever known. He stared at the image for a long time. The creatures in the picture were small and soft and fragile looking, standing in front of a crude settlement on a green and blue world. They looked like humans. They looked exactly like humans. He closed his 4 eyes and pressed the crystal against his chest and whispered into the darkness of his room, speaking to no one and to everyone at the same time. They will not listen. They never listen. And the humans will do what the humans have always done. They will survive, and then they will come back, and the galaxy will learn what my people learned 12,000 years ago, that there is nothing more dangerous in this universe than a species that remembers everything and forgives nothing. Outside his window, the stars burned cold and silent, and somewhere far away, on a small blue world circling an ordinary yellow sun, 9 billion. Humans were about to learn that the galaxy had just declared them prisoners in their own home, and not one of them was going to accept it. The enforcement fleet of the Galactic Accord dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Nova Meridian on a Tuesday morning, and the sky above the colony went dark with warships. There were over 300 vessels, veiled dreadnoughts with their angular hulls like blades stacked on top of blades. Rythani mine ships that pulsed with a sickly blue glow, and dozens of smaller support craft from a half-dozen other species who had sent their navies to prove their loyalty to the Accord. Admiral Gelvan commanded the fleet from the bridge of the Vale flagship, a massive warship called the Iron Verdict, and he looked down at the green and brown world below him, with the casual disinterest of someone swatting an insect. Nova Meridian was humanity's oldest colony, founded just 40 years earlier by settlers who had crossed the stars with nothing but hope and stubbornness. And in those 40 years, they had turned a barren rock into a living world with forests and farms, and cities that glowed warm in the night. 60 million humans lived there, and they had no idea that the next few hours would change everything. The colonial defense fleet scrambled to meet the Accord armada, and it was brave and it was hopeless. 22 ships against 300, old frigates and converted cargo haulers, manned by crews who knew they were going to die, but flew out anyway, because that is what humans do when someone threatens their home. The battle lasted less than 3 hours. Admiral Gelvan did not even watch most of it. He reviewed supply reports, while his tactical officers coordinated the destruction of the human ships one by one. Each kill marked by a small flash of light on the view screen that meant another 100 human lives had ended in fire and vacuum. When it was over, and the last human ship was drifting wreckage, the Admiral finally looked up and gave the order to begin the ground operation. At Corvath's Landing and Helios Prime, humanity's other 2 colonies, within the same week. And at each world, the pattern was the same. A tiny human fleet fighting against impossible odds, a quick and brutal defeat, and then the occupation. But it was Nova Meridian where the worst thing happened. The Rythani Collective had brought a weapon. They called it the Quieting Field, a massive psychic projector mounted on one of their mine ships that could broadcast a wave of neural suppression across an entire continent. The idea was simple. Activate the field, and every human on the surface would become calm and compliant, their fear and anger washed away by a tide of artificial peace, making the forced evacuation easy and bloodless. The Rythani had tested it on other species before, and it had always worked. A few hours of disorientation, some headaches, and then cooperation. What they did not know, what they had never bothered to learn, was that human. Children's brains are different from human adults' brains. A child's mind is still growing, still forming connections, still building the architecture of thought and feeling. And when the quieting field hit Nova Meridian, the adults felt it as a wave of dizziness and confusion. Unpleasant, but survivable. The children felt it as a wall of fire inside their skulls. The screaming started within seconds. Thousands of children across the colony's largest city, Meridian City, began to scream all at once. a sound so terrible that even the Rithani operators flinched behind their psychic shields. Parents ran to their children and found them on the ground, shaking, bleeding from their noses and ears, their small hands pressed against their heads as if trying to hold their minds together. By the time the Rithani shut the weapon down, and they were slow to do it because they did not understand what was happening, and their first instinct was to increase the power, rather than cut it, 40,000 children were dead. 40,000. The youngest was 3 months old, a baby named Elias Soren, the grandson of a military officer named Anika Soren, who was stationed back on Earth, and who received the news through a classified communication channel 6 hours later. The galaxy called it an accident, a tragic miscalculation, an unforeseen biological incompatibility. And the Rithani expressed what they called regret, which was a carefully worded statement that managed to avoid actually apologizing for anything. The event became known as the Silence of Nova Meridian, because after the screaming stopped, there was a quiet on that world that was not peace. It was the absence of something that could never be replaced. The evacuations continued. Millions of humans were loaded onto transport ships and ferried back to Earth, like cargo being returned to a warehouse. Families separated, homes abandoned, entire lives left behind on worlds that had been their children's birthplaces. At Korvath's landing, the evacuation was rougher. The colonists resisted, and the Veil ground troops used force, and there were beatings and broken bones and a handful of shootings that were classified as necessary enforcement actions. At Helios Prime, the colonists went quietly, but their silence was not compliance. It was the heavy, burning silence of people who were counting every face and memorizing every name and storing every injustice in a place deep inside where fire is kept. Back on Earth, the Terran Commonwealth government held an emergency session that lasted 3 days, and at the end of it, the Prime Minister went on every broadcast channel and announced that Earth was formally accepting the terms of the Terran Containment Act. The galaxy exhaled. The human problem was solved, but in a bunker 2 kilometers beneath the Pacific Ocean, in a facility that did not appear on any map or any official record, a different kind of meeting was taking place. The room was cold and lit by blue-white lights that made everyone look like ghosts, and there were 200 people sitting in rows of metal chairs, scientists, engineers, military strategists, intelligence operatives, hackers, and a handful of people whose skills did not have official names. At the front of the room stood General Anika Soren. She was 61 years old, and she looked like she had been carved from the same stone as the mountains. Hard and sharp and unmovable. And her eyes were the eyes of a woman who had received a message 6 days ago telling her that her 3-month-old grandson was dead because an alien weapon had melted his brain. She did not cry when she received that message. People who knew her said she simply went very still, like a machine switching from one mode to another. And when she moved again, she was something different from what she had been before. Stood before the 200, and she did not waste time with introductions or speeches about duty or patriotism. Instead, she pressed a button on the console behind her, and the room filled with sound. It was the recording from Nova Meridian, the screaming, 40,000 children screaming at the same time, and it went on for 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. When she turned it off, several people in the room were crying, and one man had vomited into a bag, and everyone was staring at her with eyes that burned. "That is the sound of what they did to our children," Anika Soren said, and her voice was flat and steady and cold. "The galaxy thinks we have surrendered. The galaxy thinks we are beaten. The galaxy thinks the human problem is solved." She paused and looked at each face in the room. "The galaxy is wrong." She pressed another button, and a holographic display filled the air above their heads. Schematics, star charts, weapons, designs, intelligence networks, timelines stretching decades into the future. "This is the Prometheus Directive," she said. This is everything we are going to build, everything we are going to learn, and everything we are going to become in the years ahead. The blockade they have put around our solar system is not a prison, it is a cocoon. And when we come out the other side, we will not be the species they pushed around today. She looked at the display and then back at her people. We are going to be patient, we are going to be silent, we are going to let them forget about us, and then we are going to remind them why they should never have touched our children. A young engineer in the second row raised his hand. How long? He asked. General Soren did not hesitate. As long as it takes. 10 years, 20, 50. It does not matter. Humans are very good at waiting when they have something worth waiting for. And the room went dark, except for the blue-white lights overhead. You are the beginning, she said. Now, begin. And in that cold room beneath the ocean, on a planet that the galaxy had just locked in a cage, 200 humans looked at each other and made a silent promise that would take 50 years to keep. Above them, the stars turned, and the blockade ships settled into their orbits, and the galaxy moved on to other business, satisfied that the brief disruption called humanity had been properly managed. They had no idea what they had started. They had no idea what was growing in the dark. The first year was chaos and grief and rage, and the people of Earth screamed into the sky at a blockade they could not break and a galaxy that did not care. The second year was quieter because the screaming had worn their throats raw, and there was nothing left to do but work. By the fifth year, the Prometheus Directive had spread like roots beneath the surface of human civilization, invisible, silent, and growing in every direction at once. General Anika Soren ran it all from the Pacific Bunker, which had expanded into a vast underground complex that stretched for kilometers beneath the ocean floor, connected to similar facilities on every continent, by tunnels and encrypted communication lines that the blockade ships could not detect. The blockade itself was a ring of 200 Accord warships orbiting just beyond Mars. Their sensors pointed inward, watching for any sign that humans were trying to build warships or develop weapons that could threaten the galaxy. Galactic order. They watched carefully for the first 3 years. Then they watched less carefully. Then they barely watched at all. Because nothing happened. Earth did not try to break the blockade. No warships were built in orbit. No threatening signals were broadcast. The humans just went about their lives on their little blue world, growing food and building cities, and doing all the small, quiet things that small, quiet species do when they have been put in their place. The Veil commanders who rotated through the blockade posting began to call it the nursery shift, babysitting duty for a species that had learned its lesson. What they did not see was what was happening underground and in the deep places of the solar system, where their sensors could not reach. In the first decade, the Prometheus Directive focused on intelligence. They needed to know everything about every species that had voted for their containment, every fleet, every weapon, every weakness, every political division, every fear. They built the Spectre networks, the most ambitious intelligence operation in the history of any species. Using a combination of human hackers and artificial intelligence systems that were decades ahead of anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Spectres did not look like spies. They looked like software, tiny programs hidden inside the communication systems of every major galactic power, disguised as routine maintenance code, spreading from system to system like a virus that never made its host sick. Within 15 years, the Spectres were inside everything. Military command networks, diplomatic channels, trade databases, personal communications of admirals and senators and corporate executives. Earth could hear every whisper in the galaxy, and no one knew they were listening. In the second decade, the focus shifted to technology. Human scientists had always been creative, but containment had made them desperate. And desperate humans are the most dangerous engineers in the universe. They could not trade with other species, so they had to invent everything themselves. But they did not start from nothing. During the brief decades before containment, human traders and diplomats had collected samples and scans and data from dozens of alien technologies. And all of that information was now fed into the Prometheus labs. The humans did not just copy what they found. They asked a question that no other species seemed to ask. What if we made it better? The Veil had fusion drives that could push a warship to half the speed of light. Human engineers studied those drives for 3 years and then built the Wraith drive, which could push a ship faster than light while producing zero detectable energy signature. A ghost engine for ghost ships. The Rithani had their psychic weapons. Human neuroscientists studied the quieting field data, Meridian, which they examined with the cold fury of people dissecting the weapon that killed their children. And they built neural dampeners that could block any psychic attack completely. And then they built something else, something they called the Echo. A device that could turn a psychic attack back on the attacker, amplified 100-fold. The Morath had advanced materials science. Human engineers took their principles and developed hull plating that could absorb energy weapons fire, and convert it into power for the ship's own systems. The harder you hit a human ship, the stronger it got. By the 30th year, the first Lazarus-class dreadnoughts were being built. Not in orbit, where the blockade could see them, but deep in the Oort cloud, the vast sphere of ice and rock that surrounded the solar system, billions of kilometers from Earth. The Oort cloud was perfect. It was enormous, and dark, and cold, and the blockade ships never patrolled it, because there was nothing out there worth watching. Except there was. Inside hollowed-out asteroids the size of mountains, human shipyards worked around the clock, building warships that were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Sleek and dark, and covered in sensor-absorbing armor that made them invisible to every detection system known to exist. Each Lazarus carried weapons that had no equivalent in any alien arsenal. Quantum disruption cannons that could tear a ship apart at the molecular level. Swarm missiles guided by AI systems that could outthink any defense network. And the echo arrays that would turn the Rithani's greatest weapon into their greatest nightmare. By the 40th year there were 300 of them hiding in the dark. By the 50th year there were 700. And during all of this, all 50 years, the Prometheus Directive ran a second operation that was just as important as the military buildup. They called it Project Kindling, and it was the most patient act of sabotage ever conceived. Using the Spectre networks, human intelligence operatives spent 30 years carefully and subtly destabilizing the alliance between the Veil Dominion and the Rithani Collective, the two powers that had led the push for containment. They planted false intelligence reports that made each side suspicious of the other. They manipulated trade agreements to create economic friction. They leaked embarrassing communications that eroded trust between key leaders. They funded and encouraged dissident movements within both empires. It was slow work. A whisper here, a forged document there, a carefully timed revelation that turned allies into rivals. And by the 50th year, the Veil Rithani alliance was held together by habit and pride, and nothing else. The galaxy had no idea that a single species, locked behind a blockade on a tiny world, had been pulling their strings for half a century. In the entire galaxy suspected that something was wrong, and no one listened to him. Elder Vorshan, now so old that his body was more machine than flesh, spent his final decades monitoring the data streams from Earth's solar system, with equipment he had built himself in his quarters aboard a research station far from the conclave. He noticed things, tiny things, a communication relay that reset itself for no reason, a trade database that had an extra line of code that should not have been there, a Veil Admiral's private messages that showed a subtle change in tone over several years, as if someone was gently steering his opinions. Each anomaly was small enough to be nothing. Together they were a pattern, and the pattern terrified him. He petitioned the conclave 3 more times over those 50 years, once in the 20th year, once in the 35th, and once in the 48th, and each time he was ignored more completely than the last. Final time. The conclave did not even let him speak. They simply noted his request and moved to the next item on the agenda. Vorshan returned to his quarters and sat in the dark and thought about the species that had destroyed his people 12,000 years ago, and how they too had been silent for decades before they struck. He thought about the humans and their quiet blue world, and the blockade that everyone believed was a cage. He knew it was not a cage. It was a chrysalis, and the thing that was growing inside it was almost ready to emerge. On the edge of the solar system, far beyond the orbit of the blockade ships, a Vale Border Patrol cruiser detected a faint energy reading in the Oort cloud, barely a flicker, like a candle seen through fog. The captain ordered an investigation, and the cruiser spent 6 hours scanning the area, weaving between ancient asteroids and frozen comets in the endless dark. They found nothing, silence, and the cold black emptiness of deep space. The captain logged the reading as a sensor glitch and turned the ship around and headed back to the blockade line. As the cruiser's engines flared and it pulled away, the darkness behind it shifted. 700 warships, black and silent and massive, hung motionless among the asteroids, their wraith drives cold, their weapons dormant, their crews watching the Vale cruiser shrink to a dot and then disappear. On the bridge of the lead ship, the TCS Remembrance, Fleet Admiral Kale Okonkwo checked a message from Earth on his encrypted display. It was from General Soren, now 87 years old, and still sharp as a blade. The message was 2 words, "Not yet." Okonkwo closed the display and looked out at the darkness and the hidden fleet and the distant stars that had no idea what was coming. "Not yet," he repeated to himself, and he smiled the kind of smile that had no warmth in it. Smile of a man who had been waiting his entire life for a moment that was finally almost here. In the silence of the Oort cloud, 700 ships waited with the patience that only humans possess. The patience of a species that had spent 50 years turning grief into steel and rage into precision and a promise into a plan. The galaxy had forgotten about them. That was exactly what they wanted. The 50th anniversary of the silence of Nova Meridian began like any other day across the galaxy. The Vale Dominion's markets opened at their usual hour. The Rithani Collective's telepathic networks hummed with routine traffic, and the 42 species of the Galactic Accord went about their business with the comfortable certainty that the universe was as it should be. At exactly midnight by Earth's clock, a time chosen with deliberate precision, every communication relay, spy satellite, early warning system, and military sensor network in the galaxy went dark. All of them, at the same time. The Spectre networks, those tiny programs that had been hiding inside alien systems for decades, activated their kill switches simultaneously, and in 90 seconds, the galaxy went from a web of connected civilizations to a collection of blind and deaf worlds screaming into static. Aboard the Iron Verdict, now a museum ship in orbit above the Vale homeworld, the automated systems came alive with error messages, and the skeleton crew that maintained the vessel stared at their screens in confusion, as every display filled with the same symbol, a human handprint in red. On 17 Rithani mine ships scattered across 6 systems, the psychic communication arrays that linked the collective's hive mind together began broadcasting a sound, a recording that every Rithani recognized with dawning horror. The screaming of children, the children of Nova Meridian, played on a loop directly into the telepathic consciousness of every Rithani within range. And then the Wraith drives engaged. 700 human warships materialized in 16 star systems across the galaxy at the same moment, not drifting in from the edges of sensor range like normal ships, but simply appearing as if they had always been there. Dark shapes against the stars that had been invisible 1 second and terrifyingly real the next. Fleet Admiral Kale Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the TCS Remembrance, in the heart of the Vale home system, and gave the order that began the largest coordinated military operation in the history of the universe. Phase 2. Execute. What followed was not a war. A war implies two sides fighting. This was surgery performed with a blade that had been sharpened for 50 years. In the Vale home system, 200 Lazarus-class dreadnoughts opened fire on every military installation in range. Shipyards, weapons depots, orbital defense platforms, fleet command centers. Each target struck with quantum disruption cannons that dissolved metal and energy shielding alike into clouds of glowing atoms. The Vale scrambled to respond, but their communication networks were dead, and their sensor arrays were blind, and their fleet, the largest in the galaxy, was scattered across dozens of systems with no way to coordinate. Individual Vale warships launched and fought bravely, and more than a few human ships took damage, but it was like watching individual soldiers charge a fortress, courageous and futile. The Vale Dominion lost 80% of its naval capacity in the first 4 hours. In the Rathani home system, the attack was different. The Rathani did not rely on conventional weapons as much as they relied on their psychic technology, and so the human strike force targeted the collective psychic amplification arrays, massive orbital structures that boosted the Rathani's mental powers to the point where they could disable entire fleets with a thought. The Rathani tried to use those arrays against the human ships, and for a brief moment a wave of psychic energy washed over the human fleet, a command to stop, to surrender, to sleep, and it hit the neural dampeners built into every human ship, every human suit of armor, and every human skull. And it bounced back. The echo devices activated, and the Rathani's own psychic attack was reflected back at them, amplified 100-fold, and across the collective's fleet, Rathani crew members collapsed as their own weapon overwhelmed their minds, not killing them, because the humans had calibrated the echo to stun rather than destroy, but rendering them unconscious for hours. Human Marines boarded the Rathani ships and secured them without firing a shot, and when the Rathani woke up, they found themselves disarmed and under guard, staring up at human soldiers who looked at them with eyes that held no hatred, just cold, absolute determination. In system after system, the pattern repeated. Human strike forces appearing without warning, destroying military infrastructure with surgical precision, and then stopping. They did not bomb cities. They did not attack civilian populations. They did not poison water supplies or destroy food production, or target hospitals or schools. They destroyed the ability to make war, and nothing else. Restraint. That terrible, deliberate restraint frightened the galaxy more than total destruction would have, because it meant the humans were not acting out of rage. They were acting out of calculation. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they had chosen exactly how far to go, and not 1 centimeter further. 6 hours into the operation, Earth activated every broadcasting system on every captured or disabled alien vessel and sent a single transmission across the galaxy in every known language. It began with the recording, the screaming of the children of Nova Meridian, 30 seconds of sound that the galaxy had spent 50 years trying to forget. And then a voice, old and cracked, but hard as iron. The voice of General Annika Soren, 87 years old, and speaking from a command center beneath the Pacific Ocean on a world that the galaxy had tried to cage. We gave you 50 years to apologize. You gave us 50 years to prepare. This is the consequence. The message repeated on a loop for 24 hours. In the systems belonging to the 4 species that had voted against the Containment Act, the Droon, the Felhari, the Morath, and the Kess, no human warships appeared. Instead, human ambassadors arrived in civilian ships bearing gifts. Advanced technology, favorable trade agreements, medical databases, agricultural innovations, everything that Earth had developed during 50 years of isolation, offered freely to the species that had stood with humanity when it mattered. The Kess ambassador, a small bird-like creature with iridescent feathers, opened the package from Earth and found inside it a handwritten note from General Soren that read, "We do not forget our enemies, but we also do not forget our friends, and we are better at being friends." The Kess ambassador wept, because in a galaxy that ran on power and fear, someone had remembered a kindness and repaid it. Shattered remains of the Veiled Dominion's military. The reality of what had happened began to sink in. The most powerful empire in the galaxy had been dismantled in a single day by a species they had locked in a cage 50 years ago. Admiral Jelvan, now old and retired and living on an estate on the Veil homeworld, was found by human special forces who entered his home without violence and escorted him to a room where a screen had been set up. They sat him in a chair and they played for him a documentary, 50 years in the making, that contained the name, the face, the life story, and the manner of death of every single person who had died as a result of his orders during the containment operations. Every colonist killed in the orbital bombardments. Every crew member who died on the 22 ships that tried to defend Nova Meridian. Every child who screamed and bled and died when the quieting field activated. All of them. Every single one, with photographs and names and ages and the names of the people who loved them. It took 11 hours to watch. When it was over, the human soldiers uncuffed Jelvan and opened the door and told him he was free to go. He did not move for a very long time. When he finally stood, his legs could barely hold him, and the look in his compound eyes was the look of someone who has seen the true weight of what they have done and will never be able to set it down. The humans did not execute him. They did not need to. They had done something worse. They had made him understand. In his quarters on a research station, far from the fighting, Elder Vorshan watched the broadcasts with his 4 pale eyes and his ancient, broken heart. He watched the Veil fleets burn and the Rithani collapse under the weight of their own reflected weapon, and the human ships moving through the galaxy with the precision of a species that had planned every detail of this moment for half a century. He did not smile. He did not feel satisfaction. He felt only the old, familiar sadness of someone who had seen this before, 12,000 years ago, when a different young species had risen from behind a different cage and broken a different empire into pieces. He closed his eyes and pressed his data crystal against his chest and spoke to the ghosts of his people. I told them what happens when you corner something that remembers, but they never listen. None of them ever listen. Outside his window, the galaxy was on fire with change, and the species that everyone had forgotten was teaching the universe a lesson it should have learned 12,000 years ago. 2 years had passed since the day the galaxy learned to fear the word human, and the universe was a different place. The old galactic accord was gone, dissolved not by force, but by the simple fact that an organization built on the idea that certain species could be contained and controlled had no right to exist in a universe where the most contained species had just proven that cages only work if the thing inside is weaker than the thing outside. In its place, the Terran Accords were being negotiated at a massive diplomatic station in neutral space, a process that involved all 42 species and that moved slowly because humanity insisted on doing it properly rather than quickly. This confused the galaxy more than anything else. Every species in the known universe understood conquest. You win a war, and you take territory, and you impose your will, and you make the losers serve the winners. It was the natural order of power, and it had been the way of things for as long as anyone could remember. But the humans did not conquer. They did not claim a single alien world. They did not demand tribute. They did not install human governors on Veil planets or human overseers in Rithani institutions. They did not enslave anyone or humiliate anyone or force anyone to kneel. Instead, they sat at a table, and they talked, and what they said was so strange that half the galaxy thought it was a trick. "We do not want your worlds," said Ambassador Kale Okonkwo, who had traded his admiral's uniform for a diplomat's suit, with the same calm efficiency he had used to coordinate the destruction of the Veil Navy. "We do not want your obedience. We want your agreement. We want rules that protect everyone, including us, including you, including the species that have not been born yet." The terms of the Terran Accords were simple and they were non-negotiable. First, no species may blockade, contain, or forcibly relocate. Another, the idea that any civilization had the right to cage another was declared a crime against the fundamental dignity of sentient life. Second, all psychic weapons, neural suppression devices, and weapons of mass mental disruption were banned permanently across the entire galaxy, with enforcement mechanisms that had real teeth and real consequences. Third, a new judicial body called the Tribunal of Remembrance would be established, staffed equally by representatives of all species, charged with one purpose: ensuring that atrocities were never buried, never forgotten, and never repeated. Fourth, Earth's colony worlds would be returned to human governance immediately, and reparations would be paid for the damage done during the containment, particularly for Nova Meridian. The Veil Dominion fractured under the pressure of these negotiations. 3 factions emerged, each pulling in a different direction. The first faction, led by old military commanders, wanted revenge. They called for a new war against humanity, a full mobilization, a refusal to accept what they saw as humiliation. But their fleets were gone, and their shipyards were rubble, and their calls for war rang hollow in empty docks. The second faction wanted complete submission. They argued that the only way to survive was to give the humans whatever they wanted, to become a client species, to trade pride for safety. And their fear was understandable, but their cowardice was not. The third faction, smaller than the others, but growing every day, wanted something that the Veil had never tried before: genuine reform. They looked at what had happened, and they did not blame the humans. They blamed themselves. They blamed the arrogance that had led their empire to cage a species and kill its children, and then celebrate as if they had done something clever. This third faction was led by a young Veiled diplomat named Fessick, who had been a child when the Containment Act was passed, and who had grown up in a society that taught him humans were dangerous animals, and who now looked at the evidence and saw that the most dangerous thing in the universe was not humanity, but the kind of certainty that makes you believe you have the right to decide who deserves to be free. The Rithani Collective experienced something even more profound, a cultural crisis that shook the foundations of their entire civilization. The Rithani were telepaths. They shared thoughts and feelings as naturally as other species shared words. And when the truth about the quieting field and the children of Nova Meridian was broadcast across their collective consciousness during the unveiling, every single Rithani in the galaxy felt it. Not just the facts, the feelings. 40,000 children dying in pain, the grief of their parents, the rage and sorrow that had burned in human hearts for 50 years. All of it transmitted through the echo. Devices directly into the Rithani hive mind with perfect clarity. For the first time in their history, the Rithani experienced human emotion at full intensity, and it broke something inside them. Not their minds, but their certainty. The comfortable belief that they were a superior species whose psychic abilities gave them the right to judge and control others. Many Rithani could not eat or sleep for weeks after the unveiling. The echo of those dying children's pain lingered in their shared consciousness like a wound that would not close. And for the first time, individual Rithani began to question whether their collective way of life, built on the assumption of psychic supremacy, was as noble as they had always believed. Some of them began to seek out humans, not to apologize, because the Rithani did not have a word for apology in their language. but to understand, to sit with human families and listen to their stories and feel their emotions and try to comprehend the depth of what had been done. It was awkward and painful, and sometimes it went badly, but it was happening, and that was more than anyone had expected. In the midst of all this change, one invitation was sent that mattered more than all the treaties and negotiations combined. Elder Vorshan, 12,000 years old, and held together by technology and willpower and nothing else, was invited to serve as the first honorary chair of the Tribunal of Remembrance. He accepted, and when he stood before the assembled representatives of 42 species to give his acceptance speech, the chamber was silent in a way it had not been since the day he had warned them about humanity and they had laughed. He did not remind them of that day. He did not need to. Every face in the room carried the memory. Instead, he told them a story. The full story. The one he had only hinted at 52 years ago. He told them about the Thyraxi Empire. 400 systems. Its billions of citizens. Its fleets and its cities and its art and its children. Everything his people had been. He told them about the young species they had found on a small world. Primitive, passionate, stubborn, growing too fast, spreading too far, just like the humans. He told them about the containment, the burning of colonies, the forced relocations, the quiet decades that followed when the Thyraxi celebrated their wisdom and forgot their cruelty. He told them about the day the silence ended and the young species came back and destroyed everything. Every system, every fleet, every world, until there was nothing left but ash and one survivor. And then he told them the truth that made the chamber gasp. The species that destroyed my people 12,000 years ago, he said, his ancient voice carrying the weight of epochs, was not some forgotten alien race lost to history. Their descendants are still here, sitting in this chamber. They are the ones you tried to cage. They are the humans. The silence that followed was absolute. The same species, Vorshan continued, the same fire, the same pattern, cornered and hurt and underestimated, and then rising with a fury that shattered an empire. I recognized them the moment I first saw them because I had seen those eyes before. I had seen that determination. I had felt that capacity for both terrible violence and extraordinary mercy. He paused and looked at the human delegation, and something passed between him and Ambassador Okonkwo, a recognition, a sorrow, an understanding that transcended species and time. But here is what is different, the elder said, and his voice softened. 12,000 years ago, the species that became humans destroyed the Thyraxi completely. They burned everything, they left nothing standing, and the universe was poorer for it. He straightened as much as his ancient body would allow. Today they had the power to do the same thing. They had the ships and the weapons and the fury. They could have burned the Vale homeworld to glass. They could have silenced the Rathani forever. They could have erased every species that wronged them from the universe, and no one could have stopped them. His pale eyes swept the chamber. And they chose not to. He let that sink in. They chose justice instead of annihilation, restraint instead of revenge, a table instead of a grave. And that choice, that single deliberate choice to build instead of burn, is the most important thing that has happened in this galaxy in 12,000 years. General Annika Soren, 89 now, her body failing, but her mind still clear as water, was offered a seat on the new Galactic Council in recognition of her role in what the galaxy had taken to calling the human emergence. She declined. She did not give a speech or make a public statement. She simply sent a message that said, "I have done enough," and then she left Earth for the first time in 50 years. She went to Nova Meridian. The colony had been resettled in the 2 years since the unveiling. New families and new homes. New children playing in streets that had been silent for half a century. But in the center of Meridian City, there was a garden now, a memorial built on the exact spot where the quieting field had been activated. It was called the Garden of Small Voices, and it contained 40,000 flowers, one for each child, and in the center was a simple stone with no words on it, because there were no words adequate for what had happened there. Annika Soren walked into the garden on a warm afternoon, and she sat on a bench near the stone, and she looked at the flowers, and the sky, and the new city growing around this place of memory. She sat there for a long time. She thought about her grandson Elias, who would have been 50 years old now, who might have had children of his own, who might have been an engineer or a teacher or a musician, who was instead a name on a stone and a reason for everything that had followed. She thought about the 200 people in the bunker beneath the Pacific who had said yes when she said begin, and how many of them were gone now, their work finished, their lives spent in service of a promise made in a cold room full of grief. She thought about the galaxy and its new uncertain future, and whether the Terran Accords would hold, or whether someday another species would make the same mistake and corner something that should never have been cornered. A sound interrupted her thoughts. Small footsteps on the garden path. A child was walking toward her. A Vael child, young enough that its exoskeleton was still soft and translucent, its movements clumsy and curious, in the way that all children everywhere are clumsy and curious, regardless of how many legs they have. The child was from a Vael family that had come to Nova Meridian as part of a cultural exchange program, one of Fesic's reform initiatives, an attempt to build bridges between species that had recently been at war. The child did not know who Annika Soren was, did not know that the old woman on the bench was the architect of the Prometheus Directive, the mind behind the unveiling, the person who had turned grief into the most precise military operation in galactic history. The child just saw an old person sitting alone and looking sad, and children, all children, human and Vael and Rithani and Kess, have the same instinct when they see someone who is sad. The child held out a flower, a bright orange bloom native to the Vael homeworld, with petals that shimmered like captured light. Soren looked at the flower and then at the child, and something inside her that had been locked shut for 50 years broke open. She cried. Quiet, controlled tears of a general, the deep, shaking sobs of a grandmother who had lost a baby boy and spent half a century turning her grief into something the galaxy would never forget. The veiled child did not understand the crying, but it stood there patiently and held the flower until the old woman took it. "Thank you," Soren whispered, and her voice was not iron anymore. It was just a voice, an old woman's voice, tired and broken and grateful. The child smiled, a veil smile, which involved the mandibles parting in a way that looked strange to human eyes, but meant the same thing smiles mean everywhere. And then it turned and ran back down the path to its parents, who were watching from a distance, with expressions that might have been concern, or wonder, or hope. Soren held the flower for a long time, looking at its shimmering petals, feeling its alien texture against her weathered fingers. Then she stood and walked to the memorial stone and placed the flower at its base, next to the 40,000 other flowers that grew there. She looked at the sky, blue and open and free, and she took a breath, and she walked out of the garden toward whatever small, quiet life was left to her. In his chamber, on the far side of the galaxy, Elder Vorshan felt the day coming to its end, and he settled into his chair and let his ancient eyes close. He spoke one last time, not to the conclave, not to the tribunal, not to the galaxy, but to himself and to the ghosts of 12,000 years. "The galaxy asked me what makes humans so dangerous. I told them, it is not their ships, their weapons, or their fury. It is that they survive everything, and then they choose to build instead of burn. That is the most terrifying thing in the universe, and also the most beautiful." The stars turned outside his window, the same stars that had watched empires rise and fall for longer than any species could remember. And somewhere on a rebuilt world, in a garden full of flowers, an old woman and a young child had done something that no fleet and no weapon could ever accomplish. They had planted the first seed of something new, and in the way of all living things, quietly and stubbornly, and against all odds, it began to grow.